Have you ever felt that sinking feeling when confronted with a wall of unfamiliar English words? That moment when you realize just how many words stand between you and true fluency? What if I told you there's a way to break through that wall in just 1 week? Welcome to the Vocabulary Explosion, where the impossible becomes possible. Hello there, language enthusiasts. Welcome back to LMJ English, your ultimate destination for transformative English learning experiences. I'm thrilled you've joined us today for an extraordinary journey that will revolutionize how you approach vocabulary acquisition forever. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our powerful language learning strategies. Your path to English fluency starts with one simple click. Today I'm going to share the remarkable story of Sarah, who went from struggling with basic conversations to mastering 500 new English words in just 7 days. Her transformation wasn't magic, it was method. And by the end of this story, you'll have every tool you need to create your own vocabulary explosion. So are you ready to discover how anyone, yes, even you, can memorize 500 English words in just 1 week? Let's begin this incredible journey together. The challenge of vocabulary acquisition. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by the sheer number of English words you need to learn? If you have, you're certainly not alone. For most language learners, vocabulary acquisition represents one of the most formidable obstacles on the path to fluency. It's not just about memorizing words, it's about retaining them, understanding their nuances, and being able to use them naturally in conversation. This seemingly insurmountable challenge is what stopped Sarah in her tracks after years of English study. Sarah had been learning English since middle school, yet at 25 she still struggled to express herself confidently. She could recite grammar rules without hesitation, and had even scored well on standardized tests. However, when it came to real-world interactions, job interviews, casual conversations with native speakers, or even watching movies without subtitles, her limited vocabulary consistently held her back. "I would know exactly what I wanted to say," Sarah later explained, "but the words just weren't there. It was like having thoughts trapped inside my head with no way to express them." The frustration had brought her to the verge of giving up entirely. She had tried everything: flashcards, vocabulary apps, word lists, even sleeping with an English dictionary under her pillow in a moment of desperate superstition. Nothing seemed to stick. Words she thought she had learned would disappear from her memory within days, sometimes even hours. It was as if her brain had developed an immunity to new English words. This phenomenon is something researchers call the vocabulary plateau, a point at which traditional learning methods stop yielding, results and progress grinds to a halt. Many language learners hit this plateau after acquiring their first 1,000 to 2,000 words. The conventional approaches that helped them reach this level suddenly become ineffective for pushing beyond it. The reason? The human brain simply isn't designed to memorize isolated words through rote repetition. Our neural pathways require more meaningful connections to encode and retrieve information efficiently. Sarah's turning point came when she stumbled upon a video claiming that anyone could learn 500 new words in just 7 days. Initially skeptical, she almost scrolled past it. The claim seemed outlandish, possibly just another false promise in the vast ocean of language learning gimmicks. But something about it, perhaps the methodical explanation rather than hyped-up marketing, caught her attention. The video introduced a systematic approach that combined several evidence-based memory techniques specifically tailored for vocabulary acquisition. The method wasn't about studying harder or for longer hours. Instead, it proposed a completely different paradigm, working with the brain's natural memory processes rather than against them. It promised not just temporary memorization, but long-term retention and practical use of the new vocabulary. For Sarah, who had already invested countless hours in conventional study methods with disappointing results, this new approach represented a glimmer of hope. What made this method different was its foundation in cognitive science and memory research. It didn't treat vocabulary learning as a brute force exercise in repetition, but as a creative process of building neural connections through association, visualization, context, and strategic review. Most importantly, it offered a structured, 7-day plan with clear milestones and techniques tailored for each phase of the learning process. As Sarah would soon discover, the human brain is capable of extraordinary feats of memory when properly engaged. The average adult native English speaker knows between 20,000 and 35,000 words, a vocabulary they acquired not through conscious study, but through meaningful exposure and use. The challenge for language learners is to accelerate this natural process with intentional strategies that mirror how the brain naturally learns. What did I have to lose? Sarah later reflected. I had already tried everything else, and if this didn't work, I would be no worse off than I already was. With that mindset, she cleared her schedule for the next week, gathered the recommended resources, and committed fully to the 7-day vocabulary explosion challenge. Little did she know that this decision would not only transform her English skills but also revolutionize her entire approach to learning. Day 1. The awakening? This is never going to work, Sarah muttered to herself as she arranged her materials on the kitchen table early on Monday morning. The skepticism weighed heavily in her voice, but a tiny spark of hope flickered beneath it. She had cleared her schedule as much as possible for the week ahead, informed friends and family that she would be mostly unavailable, and stocked her refrigerator with prepared meals. This 7-day vocabulary challenge would demand her full attention. The first step in the method was surprisingly not about learning new words at all. Instead, it focused on understanding how memory actually works. Sarah spent the first hour watching a detailed video explanation of the science behind memory formation. She learned that the brain doesn't record memories like a camera capturing images. Rather, it constructs memories by forming neural connections, strengthening these connections through repetition, and organizing information into patterns and categories. Your brain is not a hard drive, the instructor explained. It's a pattern recognition machine. It doesn't store information passively, it actively reconstructs it each time you remember something. The stronger and more numerous the connections to a piece of information, the easier it is to retrieve. This fundamental insight shifted Sarah's perspective on vocabulary learning. She had been trying to force her brain to function like a computer database when she should have been helping it build a network of meaningful connections. With this new understanding, Sarah moved on to setting up her system. Unlike her previous approaches of randomly collecting vocabulary from various sources, this method required strategic selection of words. She was instructed to identify 500 high-value words relevant to her specific needs and interests, divided into thematic categories. For her, these included business English for her career aspirations, conversational phrases for social situations, descriptive vocabulary for travel, and technical terms related to her field of study. The system also involved preparing physical and digital tools, a dedicated notebook divided into sections, color-coded index cards, a spaced repetition app on her phone, and a voice recorder. Sarah found herself surprisingly engaged in this preparation phase. Instead of the usual dread that accompanied her vocabulary study sessions, she felt a growing sense of curiosity about this radically different approach. By mid-morning, it was time to tackle the first batch of vocabulary, 70 foundation words. These weren't random selections, but carefully chosen high-frequency words that would serve as anchors for building her vocabulary network. Instead of the typical flashcard approach of pairing a foreign word with its translation, Sarah was instructed to create rich mental associations for each word. For the word accomplish, she drew a small mountain with a flag at the top in her notebook. She then wrote a sentence connecting the word to her personal experience. I will accomplish my goal of speaking fluent English by next year. Next, she recorded herself saying the word and sentence with confident intonation. Finally, she created a mental image of herself planting a flag at the mountain summit, symbolizing accomplishment. This multisensory encoding took longer than her old method of simple repetition, but it engaged her brain on multiple levels. The method introduced her to the memory palace technique, where she mentally placed words in specific locations in her apartment. Ambition was visualized as a trophy on her bookshelf. Delegate became a miniature version of herself at her desk, assigning tasks to tiny helpers, and efficient transformed into a smoothly running clock on her kitchen wall. What initially felt silly quickly became engaging as she walked through her apartment, mentally retrieving the words from their designated locations with surprising ease. Another technique that particularly resonated with Sarah was the etymological approach. Instead of treating words as arbitrary labels, she learned to break them down into their historical components. Confidence became more memorable when she understood it came from Latin con, is with, and fidere, in trust, literally to trust in oneself. These etymological stories transformed abstract vocabulary into meaningful narratives with historical depth. By late afternoon, Sarah had worked through all 70 foundation words. Rather than feeling exhausted, she was surprisingly energized. The varied techniques had kept her engaged, and the strategic breaks enforced by the method had prevented mental fatigue. More importantly, when she tested herself on the first batch of words, she was astonished to find that she could recall not just the translations, but also the rich associations she had created for each word. "This is different," she thought as she reviewed her day's work. The words felt alive in her mind, connected to images, stories, locations, and personal experiences. They weren't isolated bits of information, but nodes in an expanding network of meaning. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a genuine sense of progress in her vocabulary learning. That evening, as instructed, she spent 30 minutes reviewing the day's words using the spaced repetition app. Then, instead of cramming more study time, she deliberately switched to a relaxing activity unrelated to language learning. The method emphasized that sleep was a crucial component of memory consolidation, and overloading the brain before bedtime could actually impair retention. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah still harbored doubts about whether she could really learn all 500 words in a week. But something had definitely changed. The vocabulary no longer felt like a collection of foreign symbols to be memorized, but like meaningful tools she was gradually making her own. Day one had awakened something in her approach to language learning, and she was genuinely curious to discover what day two would bring. Breaking the pattern. Why didn't anyone teach me this before? Sarah wondered aloud as she began her second day of the vocabulary challenge. After a good night's sleep, she was surprised to find that she could still recall most of the 70 foundation words from the previous day. This early success boosted her confidence as she prepared to tackle day two's focus, breaking free from conventional learning patterns. The morning began with a video explaining why traditional vocabulary learning methods often fail. "When you were in school," the instructor explained, "you were probably taught to memorize vocabulary through repetition and writing words repeatedly. This approach relies heavily on rote memory, which is one of the weakest forms of learning." The video went on to explain that the human brain isn't designed to remember isolated facts through repetition. Instead, it excels at remembering information that is unusual, emotionally charged, visually striking, or connected to existing knowledge. This explanation resonated deeply with Sarah. Throughout her years of English study, she had dutifully created flashcards, copied vocabulary lists, and tested herself repeatedly, only to forget most words within days. She had always assumed the problem was with her memory, not with the method itself. Now she understood that her brain had been functioning normally. It was her approach that needed to change. Day two's task was to learn 75 action words, verbs, that would bring dynamism to her English expression. But instead of the familiar flashcard method, Sarah was introduced to a powerful mnemonic technique called visualization and exaggeration. For each new verb, she was instructed to create a mental image that was bizarre, exaggerated, and personally meaningful. For the word negotiate, Sarah imagined herself at a giant table, dramatically haggling with a cartoon businessman over the price of a golden egg, their voices rising comically as they went back and forth. For hesitate, she visualized herself frozen mid-step at the edge of a swimming pool, comically wobbling as she debated whether to jump in. These vivid, often ridiculous images made the words stick in a way that simple repetition never had. "Your brain remembers the unusual and ignores the ordinary," the guide explained. "By creating these exaggerated mental scenes, you're making each word memorable." Sarah found herself enjoying the creative process, sometimes laughing out loud at the absurd images she was creating. This emotional engagement, so different from the drudgery of her previous study methods, was actually enhancing her memory formation. By midday, Sarah moved on to another powerful technique, kinesthetic learning. For this approach, she assigned a specific physical gesture to each verb. Accelerate became a swift forward motion with her hand. Contemplate was represented by tapping her temple thoughtfully. Resolve involved bringing her fist firmly into her opposite palm. As she practiced these words, she simultaneously performed their associated movements, creating a physical memory to complement the visual and verbal components. "This feels silly," she thought at first, self-conscious, even though she was alone in her apartment. But the results were undeniable. When she tested herself, the physical movements automatically triggered recall of the associated words. Her body was becoming a memory aid for her vocabulary learning. The afternoon introduced yet another novel approach, story chaining. Rather than learning words in isolation, Sarah began connecting them into miniature narratives. A sequence of 10 new verbs became a bizarre but memorable story. She decided to investigate the strange noise, only to discover her neighbor attempting to renovate his apartment at midnight. She hesitated to confront him, but eventually resolved to address the issue directly. She managed to negotiate a reasonable schedule that wouldn't disrupt the building. These story chains created contextual links between words, making them easier to recall as part of a sequence, rather than as individual items. Sarah found that when she remembered one word in the chain, the others tended to follow naturally, like beads on a string. This approach also gave her practice using the words in grammatically correct sentences, bridging the gap between passive recognition and active use. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed something unexpected happening. The new techniques weren't just helping her learn today's 75 action words, they were also reinforcing yesterday's foundation vocabulary. Words from both sets began to intermingle in her story chains and visual associations, creating a more interconnected network of vocabulary in her mind. By evening, Sarah realized she was experiencing a fundamental shift in her relationship with English vocabulary. Words were no longer intimidating foreign entities to be memorized through sheer force of will. They had become characters in her mental stories, objects in her memory palace, and movements in her physical repertoire. The language was becoming more personal, more accessible. The day concluded with a review session using the spaced repetition app, but even this familiar tool felt different now. Instead of mechanically flipping through flashcards, Sarah found herself recalling the vivid associations she had created for each word. The app's algorithm adjusted to her improved recall, presenting words at increasingly longer intervals as her memory strengthened. As Sarah prepared for bed on the second night, her initial skepticism had given way to cautious optimism. She had now learned and could recall 145 words, nearly a third of her 500-word target, in just 2 days. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that effective vocabulary learning wasn't about forcing information into her brain through repetition. It was about creating the right conditions for her brain to do what it naturally does best: form meaningful connections. I wonder what tomorrow will bring, she thought as she drifted off to sleep, her mind quietly consolidating the day's learning into long-term memory. The Memory Palace. The morning of day 3 arrived with a revelation for Sarah. As she prepared her breakfast, words from the previous 2 days spontaneously popped into her mind. Efficient, as she organized her meal prep. Accelerate, as she quickened her pace to avoid being late to start her day's learning. These words weren't appearing because she was deliberately reviewing them. They were naturally integrating into her thoughts. Something profound was changing in how her brain processed English vocabulary. Today's focus was on building what memory experts call the memory palace, an ancient technique dating back to Roman times. Sarah had been introduced to the concept briefly on day 1, but now she would develop it into a comprehensive system for organizing her growing vocabulary collection. The day's target was 80 descriptive words, adjectives and adverbs that would add color and nuance to her English expression. Imagine a place you know intimately, instructed the day's first video. Your home, your childhood house, your route to work, any location where you can mentally navigate with ease. This will become your memory palace, a mental architecture where you'll store vocabulary in specific locations. Sarah chose her apartment as her primary palace, mentally mapping out each room in detail. The technique required her to place each new word at a specific location within this mental space, accompanied by a vivid, unusual image representing the word's meaning. For radiant, she imagined the sun streaming through her bedroom window, with such brightness that everything in the room glowed golden. For meticulous, she visualized her kitchen countertop covered with perfectly aligned, precisely measured ingredients, as if prepared by a perfectionist chef. What made this approach powerful was its exploitation of the brain's exceptional spatial memory. Humans evolved to remember locations and navigate spaces, a capacity far more developed than our ability to memorize abstract information. By anchoring vocabulary to locations, Sarah was essentially converting abstract words into spatial landmarks that her brain was naturally equipped to remember. As she progressed through the morning, Sarah expanded beyond her apartment to create additional memory palaces: her parents' home for family-related vocabulary, her university campus for academic terms, and her favorite park for nature words. These multiple palaces prevented overcrowding any single mental space and created thematic organization that further enhanced recall. By midday, Sarah encountered a new challenge. Some abstract concepts proved difficult to visualize in her memory palaces. How could she create a concrete image for a word like integrity or ambiguous? The solution came in the form of a technique called embodiment. For abstract concepts, she learned to transform them into physical objects or characters that embodied their meaning. Integrity became a glass structure in her mental living room, transparent and unbroken, despite pressure from all sides. Ambiguous transformed into a shape-shifting figure that constantly alternated between two distinct forms. These personifications and objectifications made abstract vocabulary tangible and memorable within her spatial framework. The afternoon introduced another powerful dimension to her memory palace: emotional association. Research shows that emotionally charged memories are retained more effectively than neutral ones. Following this principle, Sarah began attaching emotional qualities to her word images. Serene wasn't just represented by a calm lake in her mental garden. She enhanced the image by recalling the profound peacefulness she had felt during an actual visit to a mountain lake years ago. Devastating wasn't simply visualized as a tornado in her memory palace. She connected it to the genuine sense of loss she experienced when her childhood home was damaged in a storm. Your emotional brain and your memory systems are intimately connected, explained the guide. By adding emotional resonance to your vocabulary learning, you're engaging multiple brain regions simultaneously, creating stronger neural connections for each word. This multi-layered encoding process required more time per word than traditional methods, but the depth of processing resulted in far more durable memories. As the day progressed, Sarah discovered another benefit of the memory palace technique. It naturally facilitated the chunking of related words. In her kitchen memory palace, she grouped words related to taste. Tangy, pungent, savory, bitter, and zesty all became different dishes on her mental countertop. This thematic organization created semantic networks that strengthened her understanding of how words related to each other, not just what they individually meant. By late afternoon, Sarah had placed all 80 descriptive words in various locations throughout her memory palaces. To test the system's effectiveness, she mentally walked through each palace, retrieving the words she had placed there. To her amazement, she could recall not only the words but also their definitions, example sentences, and the associative images she had created for each. The spatial organization had transformed what would normally be a chaotic collection of vocabulary into an ordered, navigable landscape of meaning. The day concluded with an integration exercise combining all 225 words she had learned so far. Using the spaced repetition app, she reviewed words from all 3 days, noticing how her recall had strengthened even for the earliest words. The review session took less time than she expected, as the memory palace provided a structure that streamlined the retrieval process. As Sarah prepared for bed on the 3rd night, she reflected on the transformation in her approach to vocabulary learning. 3 days ago, she had been trying to hammer words into her memory through repetition and willpower. Now she was creating rich mental landscapes where words existed as vivid, emotionally resonant images connected to places she knew intimately. The effort required to learn each word was greater, but the resulting memories were incomparably stronger. "I'm actually enjoying this," she realized with surprise. Vocabulary learning had transformed from a dreaded chore into a creative exercise that engaged her imagination, and with 225 words now comfortably housed in her memory palaces, she was nearly halfway to her 500-word goal. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the challenge might actually be achievable. The power of context. Sarah awoke on the 4th day with a curious sensation. She was dreaming in snippets of English. Words and phrases from her growing vocabulary had begun to infiltrate her subconscious. As she prepared for the day's learning session, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. The vocabulary was no longer confined to study periods. It was becoming an integrated part of her thinking. Day 4's focus was on what the program called contextual learning, understanding how words function within larger linguistic environments rather than as isolated units. Today's target was 70 contextual words, terms that derive much of their meaning from how they're used in sentences, conversations, and relationships with other words. "Words don't exist in isolation," began the day's instructional video. Their full meaning emerges only in context. Think of words as people. You can't truly understand someone's character from a photograph. You need to see how they interact with others in different situations. This perspective represented a significant departure from traditional vocabulary methods that treat words as standalone entities with fixed translations. The day's first exercise introduced Sarah to collocation, mapping, identifying the words that naturally pair with her target vocabulary. For the word issue, she learned common collocations like address an issue, a pressing issue, and issue a statement, each giving the word a slightly different shade of meaning. These collocations were far more useful than a simple definition because they showed how the word behaved in natural language use. Sarah created visual diagrams for each target word, placing it in the center and arranging its common collocations around it like satellites. For conduct, she mapped phrases like conduct research, conduct an orchestra, and conduct electricity, each representing a different aspect of the word's meaning. These maps revealed patterns that couldn't be captured in dictionary definitions alone. By mid-morning, Sarah moved on to a technique called contextual embedding. Instead of learning words through translations or definitions, she encountered them in authentic sentences and short paragraphs. For each target word, she read multiple examples of it being used naturally. Rather than memorizing the word subsequent, as following in time, she absorbed it through sentences like, "The initial experiment failed, but subsequent attempts proved successful," and "He made a poor first impression, but his subsequent behavior changed their opinion." This approach transformed vocabulary acquisition from an abstract memorization task into a process of pattern recognition. Sarah was learning not just what words meant, but how they behaved in their natural habitat. She found herself developing an intuitive sense for how words fit together, something that had always eluded her with traditional vocabulary methods. The afternoon introduced what would become Sarah's favorite technique, micro-stories. For each set of 5 to 7 related target words, she either read or created a short narrative that incorporated all of them naturally. One story about a job interview seamlessly integrated anticipate, qualified, impression, candidate, position, experience, and negotiate in just a few sentences. These micro-stories provided meaningful contexts that made the words more memorable than any flashcard could. "Our brains are wired for narrative," explained the guide. "We remember information better when it's presented as a story rather than as disconnected facts." Sarah found that after reading or creating these micro-stories, she could recall not just the individual words, but also their relationships to each other and the situations where they might be used. As the day progressed, Sarah encountered a technique called semantic clustering, organizing words by meaning rather than alphabetically or randomly. She grouped words related to problem-solving, resolve, address, tackle, approach, solution, words describing personal qualities, reliable, conscientious, dedicated, thorough, and words connected to change, transform, evolve, adapt, convert, transition. These semantic networks reinforced the relationships between words and created multiple retrieval paths in her memory. By late afternoon, Sarah had a revelation that fundamentally changed her perspective on vocabulary learning. She realized that knowing a word wasn't a binary state. You either know it or you don't. Instead, word knowledge existed on a spectrum, ranging from vague recognition to full productive mastery. The contextual approach was helping her move words along this spectrum, deepening her understanding of terms she thought she already knew. For instance, she had always translated actually as a simple confirmation word, but through contextual examples she discovered its use to contradict assumptions. Everyone thought he was American, but he's actually Canadian. These nuances had been invisible to her when studying words in isolation, but became apparent through contextual learning. The day concluded with an integration exercise that combined contextual learning with the memory palace technique from the previous day. Sarah placed not just individual words in her mental spaces, but entire micro-stories and collocation maps. Her memory palace was evolving from a collection of isolated vocabulary items into an interconnected linguistic landscape, where words existed in relationship to each other. As she completed her evening review, Sarah noticed that the 70 contextual words she had learned today seemed to connect naturally with many of the 225 words from previous days. Her vocabulary was no longer a list of terms to be memorized, but an expanding network of interconnected meanings. Words she had learned separately were now forming relationships in her mind, creating a more cohesive understanding of English. That night, as Sarah drifted off to sleep, she realized that her relationship with English vocabulary had fundamentally changed. She was no longer trying to memorize foreign symbols, but was beginning to inhabit a new linguistic world where words had depth, relationships, and authentic contexts. With 295 words now in her expanding network and 3 days remaining in the challenge, the goal of 500 words seemed increasingly within reach. The rhythm method. The morning of day 5 marked the beginning of the second phase of Sarah's vocabulary journey. Having built a solid foundation over the previous 4 days, she was now ready to explore more sophisticated techniques for accelerating her vocabulary acquisition. Today's focus was on what the program called the rhythm method, leveraging the powerful connection between music, rhythm, and memory. The human brain has a special relationship with music, explained the day's first video. Songs can stay with us for decades, often allowing us to recall lyrics perfectly, even if we haven't heard them in years. This extraordinary capacity for musical memory can be harnessed for language learning. Sarah was intrigued. She had noticed how easily she could recall advertising jingles from her childhood, but had never thought to apply this phenomenon to vocabulary learning. The day's target was 75 topic-specific words related to fields like business, technology, and academics, terms that often appeared in more specialized contexts. Traditionally, these specialized words were among the most difficult to remember due to their abstract nature and infrequent use in everyday conversation. The rhythm method promised to make even these challenging words stick. The morning began with vocabulary chants, rhythmic sequences that grouped words into memorable patterns based on their syllable structure and sound. Sarah found herself chanting diverse, converse, adverse, reverse to a simple beat, the rhythm helping to cement these phonologically similar but semantically distinct words in her memory. The physical act of chanting engaged her body in the learning process, creating kinesthetic memories that reinforce the verbal ones. Try creating a simple beat with your hands or a pen, instructed the guide. The physical rhythm helps synchronize your brain's language and motor centers, creating stronger memory traces. Sarah tapped out simple patterns as she recited groups of words, finding that the rhythmic framework made it easier to recall the sequences later. By mid-morning, Sarah progressed to a more sophisticated technique, vocabulary songs. The program provided simple melodies to which she could set her target words and their example sentences. For a group of business terms, she sang to negotiate the deal, to delegate the tasks, to estimate the costs, to evaluate the risks, the melody providing a structured framework that made the sequence easier to remember than a simple list. At first, Sarah felt self-conscious singing alone in her apartment, but the results were undeniable. When she tested herself, the words learned through songs were significantly easier to recall than those learned through conventional methods. The melodies seemed to create additional retrieval paths in her memory, allowing her to access the vocabulary through multiple channels. Music engages both hemispheres of your brain simultaneously, explained the guide. It combines the linguistic processing of the left hemisphere with the melodic and emotional processing of the right, creating stronger, more resilient memory traces. This multi-regional brain engagement explained why songs were such powerful vehicles for vocabulary retention. The afternoon introduced another dimension of the rhythm method, spaced repetition on a precise schedule. While Sarah had been using a spaced repetition app throughout the challenge, Day 5 introduced a more sophisticated timing algorithm based on memory research. Rather than reviewing words at arbitrary intervals, she now followed a precise schedule. First review after 10 minutes, second after 1 hour, third after 1 day, and subsequent reviews at 3 days, 7 days, and 14 days. The timing of review is critical, the guide emphasized. Review too soon and you're wasting effort on information that hasn't begun to fade. Review too late, and you're essentially relearning rather than reinforcing. The scientifically optimized intervals ensured that Sarah reviewed each word precisely when it was starting to fade from memory. The perfect moment for strengthening. Retention. As she implemented this structured review schedule, Sarah noticed something surprising. Words she had learned earlier in the week were becoming progressively easier to recall, requiring less effort with each review. The spaced repetition was clearly working, gradually transferring vocabulary from short-term to long-term memory through strategically timed reinforcement. By late afternoon, Sarah combined the rhythmic techniques with her growing collection of memory strategies, She placed vocabulary songs at specific locations in her memory palace, created rhythmic micro-stories that incorporated multiple target words, and developed musical mnemonics for particularly challenging terms. This multifaceted approach engaged different learning modalities simultaneously, creating redundant memory pathways that significantly enhanced recall. One particularly effective technique introduced on day 5 was the vocabulary wave, alternating between intense focus and relaxed diffusion. Sarah would concentrate intensely on learning a set of words for 25 minutes, then take a 5-minute break, during which she would do something completely different. Stretch, look out the window, or make a cup of tea. This cycle leveraged the phenomenon of unconscious processing, allowing her brain to continue consolidating vocabulary even during the breaks. Learning doesn't just happen during active study, explained the guide. Some of the most important memory consolidation processes occur when you're not consciously focusing on the material. Sarah found that words often became clearer and more accessible after these short breaks, as if her brain had been quietly organizing the information while her conscious attention was elsewhere. The day concluded with what the program called sleep preparation, a specialized review technique designed to optimize memory consolidation during sleep. In the 30 minutes before bed, Sarah reviewed her most challenging words from the day, creating strong mental images and connections for each. Research has shown that information reviewed just before sleep has a higher likelihood of being processed and consolidated during the night. As she completed her 5th day, Sarah's vocabulary collection had grown to 370 words, nearly 3/4 of her 500-word target. More importantly, her confidence had grown dramatically. Words that would have seemed intimidating just 5 days ago now felt like familiar acquaintances with distinct personalities and relationships. The rhythm method had added a new dimension to her learning, engaging the musical and temporal processing capabilities of her brain alongside the visual and semantic systems activated by earlier techniques. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, the melodies of her vocabulary songs played softly in her mind. Her brain, primed by the pre-sleep review, would spend the night strengthening the neural pathways created during the day, moving her one step closer to her vocabulary explosion. Goal: social immersion. Day 6 dawned with a sense of anticipation. With 370 words now in her active vocabulary, Sarah was approaching the final stretch of her 7-day challenge, but today would introduce an element that had been missing from her intensive study so far: social interaction. The day's focus was on what the program called social immersion, taking vocabulary from the private realm of study into the dynamic environment of conversation. Words were never meant to live on paper or in apps, began the day's instructional video. Language evolved for communication between people. To truly cement vocabulary in your mind, you need to use it in social contexts. This principle addressed a common problem among language learners: the gap between recognizing words and actually using them in real-time conversation. Today's target was 65 conversational words, phrases, idioms, and expressions that appear frequently in social interactions. Unlike the previous day's vocabulary, these words were selected specifically for their high utility in dialogue, rather than for their thematic grouping or grammatical function. The morning began with a technique called dialogue construction. Working with the program's audio resources, Sarah practiced short conversations that incorporated her target vocabulary. Rather than passive listening, this active dialogue construction required her to pause the recording at specific points and respond with phrases that included her new vocabulary. This simulated the back-and-forth rhythm of real conversation, training her to access vocabulary under time pressure. Conversation doesn't give you the luxury of time, explained the guide. You need to retrieve words in seconds, not minutes. These dialogue exercises train your brain for the rapid recall required in real-world interactions. Sarah found these exercises challenging at first. There was a significant difference between recognizing a word on a flashcard and producing it naturally in conversation. But with practice, her response time gradually improved. By mid-morning, Sarah moved on to a more advanced technique, virtual immersion. Using language exchange apps recommended by the program, she connected with native English speakers for short practice conversations. She wasn't yet trying to have completely natural discussions. Instead, these were structured interactions designed to incorporate specific vocabulary from her growing collection. Before each conversation, Sarah prepared a set of 10-15 target words she wanted to practice. She didn't force these words awkwardly into the dialogue, but looked for natural opportunities to use them. When discussing weekend plans with a conversation partner from Canada, she deliberately incorporated words like anticipate, spontaneous, and primarily into her responses. This real-time application of vocabulary in a social context created powerful emotional and contextual associations that significantly enhanced retention. The emotional engagement of real conversation creates memory hooks that no solo study method can match, noted the guide. When you associate a word with a real person and a genuine interaction, it becomes part of your lived experience rather than just an item to memorize. Sarah found this to be true. Words she used successfully in conversation seemed to stick more firmly in her memory than those she had only studied privately. The afternoon introduced another dimension of social learning: feedback loops. In traditional vocabulary study, learners rarely receive immediate feedback on their word usage. But in conversation, the reactions of native speakers provide instant information about the appropriateness and effectiveness of vocabulary choices. When Sarah used the word concise in describing her approach to writing emails, her conversation partner's positive response reinforced the correct usage. When she attempted to use perceive in another context and noticed a slight confusion in her partner's expression, she immediately learned something about the word's typical usage patterns. Native speakers give you subconscious feedback all the time, explained the guide. Their facial expressions, clarification questions, and natural responses tell you whether you're using words appropriately. This feedback loop accelerates your learning in ways that self-study cannot. Sarah began paying careful attention to these subtle cues, using them to fine-tune her understanding of word meanings and usage contexts. As the day progressed, Sarah discovered an unexpected benefit of social immersion. It revealed gaps in her vocabulary knowledge that hadn't been apparent during private study. Words she thought she understood perfectly sometimes proved challenging to use naturally in conversation. This real-world testing exposed areas where her grasp of nuance or collocation was incomplete, allowing her to address these gaps immediately rather than developing incorrect usage habits. By late afternoon, Sarah had engaged in 6 different practice conversations with partners from various English-speaking countries. Each interaction had not only reinforced her target vocabulary, but had also exposed her to authentic language use by native speakers. She found herself picking up natural phrases and expressions that hadn't been part of her formal study plan, an organic expansion of her vocabulary beyond the structured program. The day concluded with a reflection and integration exercise. Sarah reviewed recordings of her conversations, noting instances where she had successfully incorporated target vocabulary and identifying areas for improvement. She then connected these real-world experiences with her existing memory techniques, adding conversational context to words in her memory palace and incorporating dialogue snippets into her vocabulary songs. As she completed her evening review, Sarah realized that the social immersion had transformed her relationship with the vocabulary in a fundamental way. Words that had been abstract entities to be memorized were now connected to real people, conversations, and emotions. She had discussed weekend plans with Michael from Toronto, debated favorite films with Olivia from London, and shared travel experiences with James from Sydney, each conversation embedding vocabulary in rich personal contexts that significantly enhanced retention. With day 6 complete, Sarah's active vocabulary had grown to 435 words, just 65 short of her 500-word target. More importantly, these weren't just words she could recognize or define, they were words she had actually used in conversation. The gap between passive knowledge and active use was beginning to close through the power of social immersion. That night, as Sarah reviewed her progress and prepared for the final day of the challenge, she felt a growing confidence in her ability to actually use her expanding English vocabulary. The words were no longer foreign entities to be studied, but practical tools for genuine communication. With just one day remaining in the challenge, she was ready for the final integration that would complete her vocabulary explosion. The integration. The 7th and final day of Sarah's vocabulary challenge dawned with a mixture of excitement and reflection. 6 intensive days of learning had expanded her active English vocabulary by 435 words, an achievement that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. Now, on day 7, she faced the dual challenge of acquiring the final 65 words and more. Importantly, integrating her entire 500-word collection into a cohesive, accessible mental network. The final day isn't just about adding more words, began the day's instructional video. It's about weaving everything together into a unified system that you can access fluently and confidently. This integration phase was what separated temporary memorization from genuine language acquisition, transforming isolated vocabulary items into an interconnected linguistic resource. The morning began with the introduction of the final vocabulary set, 65 advanced words selected for their sophistication and expressive power. These were terms that would elevate Sarah's English from functional to impressive, words like meticulous, paramount, discern, and eloquent. Rather than representing a specific category, these words were chosen to fill expressive gaps across various domains, giving Sarah's vocabulary more precision and nuance. For these final words, Sarah applied a technique called layered encoding, a comprehensive approach that combined all the most effective methods from the previous 6 days. Each word was simultaneously placed in a specific location in her memory, Palace connected to a vivid, unusual mental image, incorporated into a micro-story with other related words, set to a rhythmic pattern or simple melody used in a practice conversation, with a language partner, grouped with semantically related terms in a concept map. This multidimensional encoding created numerous pathways to each word, ensuring that Sarah could retrieve it through various mental processes. If one retrieval method failed, another would likely succeed, creating a redundancy that significantly enhanced accessibility. Think of each encoding method as a different door into the same room, explained the guide. The more doors you create, the more easily you'll be able to access the word when you need it. Sarah found that this comprehensive approach, while time-intensive for each word, created extraordinarily durable memories. Words encoded through multiple methods seemed to acquire a solidity and accessibility that single-method learning couldn't match. By mid-morning, Sarah moved on to what the program called network strengthening, techniques designed to enhance the connections between words rather than just reinforcing individual vocabulary items. One powerful exercise had her creating word webs, where she placed a target word in the center of a page and then branched outward with related terms, opposites, synonyms, and common collocations. For enhance, her web included related terms like improve and upgrade, opposites like diminish and reduce, and common phrases like enhance performance and enhance security. These word webs transformed her vocabulary from a collection of isolated items into an interconnected network where each term existed in relationship to many others. This network structure mimicked how words are actually stored in the brain of a native speaker, not as a dictionary-like list, but as a complex web of associations and relationships. The strength of your vocabulary isn't just in how many words, you know, noted the guide, but in how richly they're connected to each other. Sarah found that as she developed these connections, her retrieval speed increased dramatically. Words were no longer isolated entities to be hunted down individually, but nodes in a network that could be navigated intuitively. The afternoon of the final day was dedicated to what the program called situational integration, applying vocabulary across various real-world contexts. Sarah engaged in a series of role-playing exercises that simulated different situations: a job interview, a business negotiation, a casual social gathering, an academic discussion, and a travel scenario. In each situation, she practiced using appropriate vocabulary from her 500-word collection, adapting her language to the context. This situational practice addressed a common problem among language learners: the context dependence of vocabulary recall. Words learned in a study environment are often difficult to access in real-world situations due to the context shift. By practicing vocabulary in simulated environments, Sarah was building retrieval pathways that would function across various contexts, making her vocabulary truly accessible regardless of the situation. As the day progressed, Sarah conducted a comprehensive review of all 500 words using the spaced repetition app. This final review revealed something remarkable. Words from the beginning of the week, which she had reviewed multiple times on the optimized schedule, were now as familiar and accessible as words she had known before starting the challenge. The intensive approach had successfully transferred these words from new acquisitions to established vocabulary in just 7 days. The day concluded with a final assessment, a series of exercises designed to measure not just Sarah's recognition of the 500 target words, but her ability to use them appropriately accurately and fluently. The assessment included multiple choice recognition, sentence completion, error correction, and free writing components. To her amazement, Sarah scored over 90% across all sections, concrete evidence of the effectiveness of the 7-day approach. As the sun set on the 7th day, Sarah recorded a video reflection on her journey. Speaking entirely in English, she naturally incorporated dozens of her newly acquired words without conscious effort, terms that would have been unavailable to her just a week ago. The words flowed naturally, integrated seamlessly with her existing vocabulary. The boundary between new words and known words had dissolved. I didn't just memorize 500 words, she reflected. I made them mine. They're not foreign entities, any more but natural tools for expression. This shift from learning words to owning them represented the true success of the vocabulary explosion method, not just expanding her word count, but transforming her relationship with the language itself. That evening, as she closed her notebooks and apps for the final time, Sarah realized that the 7-day challenge had given her much more than 500 new words. It had provided a comprehensive system for vocabulary acquisition that she could continue to apply independently. The techniques, strategies, and insights would serve her long after the structured program had ended. With a sense of accomplishment and a newfound confidence in her English abilities, Sarah looked forward to applying her expanded vocabulary in real-world situations. The vocabulary explosion had ignited a transformation that would continue to unfold in the weeks and months ahead. 500 words in 7 days wasn't just an impressive achievement, it was the beginning of a new relationship with language learning itself. Beyond the challenge. 1 month after completing her 7-day vocabulary explosion challenge, Sarah sat in a cafe reviewing her language learning journal. The transformation in her English skills had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. Not only had she retained virtually all of the 500 words she had acquired during the intensive week, but her vocabulary had continued to expand at an accelerated pace. The methods and mindset shifts from the challenge had created lasting changes in how she approached language learning. It's not just about those 500 words, she wrote in her journal. It's about what happened to my brain during those 7 days. The challenge had reconfigured her entire approach to vocabulary acquisition, transforming it from a dreaded chore into a fascinating, multidimensional process that engaged her creativity and curiosity. This fundamental shift in her relationship with language learning was perhaps the most valuable outcome of the experience. The most significant change was in how Sarah approached new words. Before the challenge, encountering unfamiliar vocabulary in books or conversations had triggered anxiety, each unknown word representing another item on an endless list of things to memorize. Now new words were opportunities for connection and exploration. When she encountered resilient in a newspaper article, she immediately created a mental image of a rubber ball bouncing back after being compressed, placed it in her memory palace, connected it to related words like persistent and enduring, and incorporated it into a micro-story. What would have once been a frustrating memorization task had become an engaging creative process. Sarah had also developed systems for maintaining and expanding her vocabulary beyond the initial 500 words. She established a daily practice that incorporated the most effective techniques from the challenge. 10 minutes with her spaced repetition app in the morning, a midday session adding 3 to 5 new words using the layered encoding approach, and an evening review integrating new vocabulary with existing knowledge. This consistent practice, requiring less than 30 minutes daily, allowed her to add approximately 100 new words each month without the intensity of the original challenge. The spaced repetition schedule remained a cornerstone of her maintenance system. Words were reviewed at scientifically optimized intervals, 1 day after learning, then 3 days, 7 days, 14 days, 30 days, and finally, 90 days. Each successful review moved the word to a longer interval until, after the 90-day review, it was considered permanently acquired. This systematic approach ensured that her vocabulary expansion was sustainable and durable rather than temporary. Sarah had also found ways to incorporate vocabulary growth into her daily life without dedicated study time. She labeled items in her apartment with sticky notes showing advanced English terms, created vocabulary-focused playlists that she listened to while commuting, and set her phone display language to English. These environmental adjustments created continuous low-intensity exposure that reinforced her vocabulary without requiring additional study time. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah had overcome the plateau that had previously stalled her English progress. The 500-word challenge had broken through this barrier, creating momentum that carried forward into subsequent learning. Words beyond the initial 500 seemed to come more easily, as if the intensive week had established neural pathways that facilitated all future vocabulary acquisition. What had once been a struggle was now a self-reinforcing process of continuous growth. 3 months after the challenge, Sarah set her sights on an even more ambitious goal, expanding her vocabulary to 5,000 active words, a level approaching educated native fluency. She developed a 12-month plan that built upon the principles from the 7-day challenge, but distributed the effort more sustainably. Rather than the intensive approach of 70-80 words daily, she aimed for 15 to 20 new words per day, a pace that allowed for thorough encoding and integration, while still leading to substantial growth over time. The plan incorporated several long-term strategies that hadn't been part of the original challenge. She established a daily English reading habit, selecting materials slightly above her comfort level to ensure regular exposure to new vocabulary in natural contexts. She joined an English conversation club that met weekly, creating regular opportunities to activate her growing vocabulary in social settings. She also began writing daily journal entries in English, challenging herself to incorporate at least 5 recently acquired words in each entry. 6 months after the challenge, Sarah experienced a breakthrough moment during a job interview conducted entirely in English. As she discussed her qualifications and experience, words flowed naturally and precisely, including many from her 500-word collection. The interviewer, a native English speaker, commented on her excellent vocabulary, a compliment that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Sarah secured the position, which required regular communication in English, creating a virtuous cycle of practice and improvement. The vocabulary explosion had catalyzed changes beyond language learning as well. The memory techniques she had learned proved valuable for other types of information. She applied the memory palace method to remember client details in her professional life, used the spaced repetition principle for professional development courses, and implemented the contextual learning approach when acquiring new skills. The meta-learning aspects of the challenge, learning how to learn effectively, had generalized to multiple areas of her life. 1 year after the 7-day challenge, Sarah recorded a video comparing her English-speaking abilities before and after the experience. The difference was remarkable. Her before-challenge self spoke hesitantly, searching for words and often settling for simpler expressions than what she intended. Her after-challenge self spoke fluidly and precisely, expressing complex thoughts with appropriate vocabulary and rarely hesitating to find the right word. The vocabulary explosion had been the turning point in her journey from struggling language learner to confident English speaker. As Sarah reflected on the entire experience, she realized that the 7-day vocabulary challenge had been about much more than memorizing 500 words. It had been about transforming her relationship with language learning, developing powerful cognitive tools that would serve her throughout life, and breaking through the artificial ceiling that had limited her progress for years. The challenge had demonstrated that with the right methods and mindset, the human brain is capable of extraordinary learning feats, not through superhuman effort, but through strategically aligned approaches that work with, rather than against, our natural cognitive processes. The vocabulary explosion wasn't the end of my learning journey, Sarah concluded in her 1-year reflection video. It was the beginning of a new way of learning, not just words, but anything I choose to master. This mindset shift represented the true legacy of the 7-day challenge, a transformation from passive educational consumer to active, strategic learner, equipped with the tools for continuous growth and development. Conclusion. A year and half after her 7-day vocabulary explosion challenge, Sarah found herself standing in front of an audience of eager language learners at an international education conference. As she prepared to share her experience and insights, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From a struggling English learner who could barely maintain a basic conversation, she had transformed into a fluent speaker delivering a keynote address to hundreds of people. "My story begins with frustration," she told the audience, naturally incorporating dozens of the advanced words she had acquired during her vocabulary explosion. "Like many of you, I spent years studying English through traditional methods with disappointingly slow progress. The turning point came when I discovered that the problem wasn't my ability, but my approach. Today I want to share how a 7-day vocabulary challenge completely transformed my relationship with language learning. As Sarah shared the details of her experience, she emphasized that the true value of the challenge wasn't just the 500 words she had acquired during that intensive week. Those words had indeed provided an immediate boost to her expressive capacity, but the lasting impact came from the learning system she had developed and the mindset shift that accompanied it. The challenge had taught her how to learn effectively, a meta skill that continued to accelerate her progress long after the initial 7 days had concluded. The most powerful realization, she explained, was understanding that our brains aren't designed to learn through the methods most of us were taught in school. When I started working with my brain's natural learning processes instead of against them, vocabulary acquisition transformed from an exhausting struggle into an engaging process that almost felt like play. The ripple effects of Sarah's vocabulary explosion had extended far beyond her English skills. The confidence gained from mastering such a substantial challenge had spilled over into other areas of her life. She had applied for and received a promotion at work, begun volunteering as an English tutor for recent immigrants, and even started learning a third language using the same principles that had proven so effective with English. When you overcome a learning challenge that once seemed impossible, she told the audience, you begin to question what other self-imposed limitations might be holding you back. The vocabulary explosion changed how I saw myself as a learner and ultimately how I saw my potential in all areas of life. Sarah's transformation had not gone unnoticed by those around her. Colleagues commented on her increasingly articulate communication. Friends observed her growing confidence in English-speaking environments, and her language tutor, initially skeptical of the 7-day approach, had begun recommending similar techniques to other students after witnessing her remarkable progress. As she concluded her presentation, Sarah invited audience members to begin their own vocabulary explosion journey. I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to learn 500 words in 7 days, she clarified. The time frame and scope can be adjusted to your circumstances. What's essential is the underlying approach, using evidence-based techniques that align with how your brain naturally learns and remembers information. She outlined a simplified version of the challenge that anyone could implement immediately. Select 10-15 high-value words relevant to your needs. Apply the layered encoding technique, combining visual associations, memory palace placement, contextual, learning and rhythmic patterns. Practice using the words in conversation, and review them according to an optimized spaced repetition schedule. Even this modest daily practice, consistently applied, will yield remarkable results over time, she assured them. The question and answer session that followed revealed how many language learners shared the frustrations that had once plagued Sarah. They described hitting plateaus, forgetting words shortly after learning them, and feeling that true fluency remained perpetually out of reach despite years of study. Their experiences confirmed that Sarah's initial struggles had not been unique, but represented common challenges in traditional language education. As the session ended and attendees gathered around to continue the conversation, Sarah reflected on how completely her relationship with English had transformed. What had once been a source of anxiety and inadequacy had become a vehicle for connection, opportunity, and personal growth. The vocabulary she had acquired during that intensive week had long since integrated seamlessly into her overall English proficiency. The artificial boundary between new words and known words completely dissolved. In her hotel room that evening, Sarah opened her laptop to answer emails and noticed a message from one of the conference attendees, a language teacher who had been inspired to implement a modified version of the vocabulary explosion approach with her students. Your story has given me hope, the message read. I've been teaching the same way for 15 years, but your results have convinced me that there's a better approach. Thank you for sharing your journey. This message crystallized for Sarah the importance of sharing her experience with others. Her transformation hadn't just been personal, it represented a case study in how evidence-based learning approaches could dramatically accelerate progress and break through the limitations of traditional education methods. By sharing her story, she could help others avoid years of frustration and ineffective study. As she prepared for bed, Sarah realized that the vocabulary explosion challenge had given her something even more valuable than 500 new English words or effective learning techniques. It had given her a profound appreciation for the brain's remarkable capacity for growth and adaptation when provided with the right conditions. This understanding, that learning limitations are often methodological rather than personal, was perhaps the most valuable outcome of her entire experience. The 7-day vocabulary challenge had not been an end point, but a beginning, the start of a journey of continuous growth, discovery, and expansion. What had begun as a focused effort to learn 500 English words had blossomed into a transformative experience that reshaped her understanding of learning itself. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah felt profound gratitude for the challenge that had sparked such an unexpected and far-reaching transformation in her life. Vocabulary list acquisition. Noun. The process of gaining something such as knowledge or a skill. The acquisition of new vocabulary requires consistent practice and effective techniques. Technique. Noun. A particular method or way of doing something. Memory palace is an effective technique for learning new vocabulary. Integration. Noun. The act of combining or adding parts to make a unified whole. The integration of new words into everyday conversation is essential for language mastery. Retention. Noun. The ability to keep or hold something in the mind. Using multiple senses improves retention of new vocabulary. Consolidation. Noun. The process of making something stronger or more solid. Sleep plays a crucial role in memory consolidation when learning new words. Fluency. Noun. The ability to speak or write a language easily, well, and quickly. Her vocabulary explosion challenge significantly improved her English fluency. Context. Noun. The circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea. Learning words in context is more effective than memorizing isolated definitions. Mnemonic. Noun. A system or pattern of letters, ideas, or associations that assists in remembering something. She created a mnemonic to help remember the spelling of necessary association. Noun. A connection or relationship between things or ideas. Creating strong mental associations helps vocabulary stick in your memory. Encoding. Noun. The process of converting information into a form that can be stored in memory. Multi-sensory encoding leads to stronger vocabulary retention. Retrieval. Noun. The action of getting something back from somewhere. Regular practice improves memory retrieval when you need to use new vocabulary. Plateau. Noun. A state of little or no change following a period of activity or progress. Many language learners hit a vocabulary plateau after mastering basic words. Immersion. Noun. The action of immersing someone or something in a substance or environment. Social immersion is crucial for moving vocabulary from passive to active use. Visualization. Noun. The formation of a mental image of something. Vivid visualization creates stronger memory hooks for new vocabulary. Collocation. Noun. The habitual juxtaposition of a particular word with another word or words. Understanding collocations helps you use words naturally like native speakers. Spaced repetition. Noun. A learning technique that incorporates increasing intervals of time between reviews of previously learned material. Spaced repetition prevents forgetting and strengthens vocabulary memory over time. Cognitive adjective, relating to the mental processes of perception, memory, judgment, and reasoning. The challenge employed various cognitive techniques to enhance vocabulary learning. Retention. Noun. The continued possession, use, or control of something. The memory palace technique significantly increased Sarah's vocabulary retention. Momentum. Noun. The quantity of motion of a moving body. Once Sarah broke through her vocabulary plateau, she gained momentum in her language learning. Transformation. Noun. A thorough or dramatic change in form or appearance. The 7-day challenge led to a complete transformation in Sarah's approach to language learning.